I'm going to teach you the basics of animators in Distance's level editor. To get started, look down in the description. You'll find a download link for this map that I have set up right here, as well as the finished version of this map that you'll see at the end of this video. Go ahead and grab the starting map, the base version that I have here, and open it up so you'll have the same setup that I have. If you don't want to download it, that's fine too. The only thing I have set up here right now is a start zone, 2 roads, a road cap end, and large cube here, and 2 smaller cubes. You can find those cubes in the simples folder. They're right here. I just have these colored a little differently in different textures, and these 2 small ones are transparent so you can see through them. Now that you've got a small map set up, the first thing you want to do to use animators is select an object that you want to animate. So let's say we want to move this cube down to be level with the road when you reach it. The first thing to do is select that object and then come down here to the Add Component button, hit that, and then select Animator. You'll also notice the Golden Animator down here. What Golden Animator does is animate the texture of a golden simple object. We don't want to do that. We want to actually animate the object itself, so we're going to hit Animator. From here it adds an animator component, and there's a bunch of different types of motion you can use. I'm just going to hit Advanced so we get a few more properties we can play with. I'm going to disable rotation because we don't need to rotate in order to move the cube down, and we're going to set translate type to global so that as you can see here, the translate type isn't affected by your scale, and it also means that your position units are the same as your translate vector. In order to get the cube to move down, we need to use the Y position, so let's just set a negative value of about 60. I think that should do nicely. We don't want any delay on this, and we want the duration to be maybe about 4 seconds. We don't want it to loop, we just want it to play once. And ease in out just means that the animation will start slowly and then it'll speed up in the middle of the animation, and then it'll slow back down when it gets near the end of the animation. We do need to animate physics because it's a collidable object, but we don't want to always animate. The only time you want to tick always animate is when it's a very large object or when it's going to be off screen but you still need it to animate. We want the default action to be play. So this means that when you start the map, the animation is just going to begin automatically. So let's play test that. And you can see right off the bat that our cube moved down, and it stopped when it got to -60 from where it was originally. And it's just going to stay here and not do anything else. So that's cool. That's the basics of using an animator. And you can play around with all these other options here, use different types of motion or translate it different ways in order to do different things with it. The next thing you might want to do is look into events so that you can trigger that animation to happen so it doesn't happen as soon as you start the map. Events are over here in the library in the events folder. There's 2 different variations of it. We have a event trigger box, you can see the name down here in the bottom, as well as an event trigger sphere. Since we have 2 little transparent cubes here, we're going to use the box variation. So I'm just going to place one of those down, and you can see that it's quite a lot larger than our small cubes here. I'm going to go ahead and move this over here and start to align it to match up with our cube. I've found that a scale of 6.5 matches the scale of these small cubes quite nicely. And the next thing I want to do is move this into the same position as our small cubes. So I'm just going to copy these positions over to our event trigger here, which can take a little bit of time, but that's okay. You should always take your time when making a map. So now that we've got these positions set up, I'm going to hold Control or Command on Mac and select the outside cube as well. So now we have both the event trigger box and this cube selected, and I'm going to hit Control or Command G to group them. You can see down here it grouped 2 objects. From there, I'm going to inspect the children of this group, meaning show all the properties of every object in the group. And from here, I'm going to look for the event trigger box properties that were part of the event trigger box. And I'm going to look for the event name. The event name is the name you're going to give the event so that you can listen for it with other animators. We're just going to call this box 1 for now. And that's pretty much all you need to do with this event trigger box. So we're done over here, and we can go back to our animated cube. What we need to do over here first is disable the default action, so it doesn't do anything when you first start the map. The next thing we need to do is add another component, but this time add an event listener. When you add an event listener, you'll notice it adds these event options as well as the event listener property itself. The first thing we're going to do is change this event name to our event that we set up over here. And the next thing we need to do is set off action to none. The on action is what happens when you touch your event trigger box, and the off action is what happens when you leave your event trigger box. So we don't want anything to happen when we leave it, and we just want it to play when we touch it. So let's play test that. And you can see that our large cube in the back isn't moving, but if we come over here and touch this cube, then the large cube starts moving. And it's going to do the same thing as it did before because we didn't change any of the animator properties. It's going to stop right here at -60 from where it was before. So that's cool. That's about the basics of animators and event triggers. What I'm going to get into now is a little bit more of the advanced usage that you can do with stacking animators and event triggers. So the first thing I'm going to do is stack an animation on this cube here. Let's say you want the cube to move down and then you want it to move across. How do you do that? Well, you need to stack the animator, but you can't just add another animator component onto this cube. So in order to do this, you need to select the cube and then hit Control G, so you create a group with just that single cube in it. Create a group with one object, just a single object group. This can get confusing sometimes, but it's just a group with one object. So now you can come down here and add another animator to this group. And from here, you can do the same thing that you did before with setting motion to advanced, disable rotate, set your translate type to global, and this time we want to move along this axis. So let's just set, I don't know, maybe 60 again. See what that does. Let's set our delay. Well, for delay, if we want it to move down first and then over across, our moving down animation takes 4 seconds because that's what we set in the previous animator. So let's set our delay to maybe 3 seconds. So right as it's getting near the bottom, it'll move across. And we want our duration, let's set it maybe 2 seconds for this one. We don't want it to loop, and let's keep that on ease in out. We do need to animate physics, don't always animate, and default action, let's set it to none, and let's see what happens. So when we hit the cube, that cube moves down, but it isn't moving across. Now what happens if we set the default action to play? You'll notice that our cube moved forward. So this actually needs to be negative. Sorry about that. And you'll notice that it moved right away. It didn't move after we touched the cube. The reason for this is because you need to listen to this event again. So we need to do the same thing that we did before with setting default action to none, adding an event listener, and setting the event name to that same event, and then setting the off action to none again. So now if we play test and we go touch this cube here, our box in the back will move and then it'll fly away. So that's how you stack animators on an object. And you can use this to great effect if you're making a large sculpture or something like that where you want to have many different animations on a single object or a single group of objects. But now let's say that you want to animate this cube after you touch both of these little boxes. This gets a little more complicated because you can't add more than one event listener to this box. So you need to have a third event trigger, and you need to animate that event trigger. This might sound confusing at first, but I'm going to go through it, so it should become a little clearer after seeing how it works. Let's go ahead and ungroup this object. That's Shift G. And what that'll do is just remove the animator that was on the group. So now it won't move backwards anymore. It's just the single cube with one animator and one event listener on it. That's something you need to pay very careful attention to when you're creating larger groups of animations. You don't want to ungroup your object because you will lose all of your animators. Be very careful of that. So let's move on to trying to use both of these cubes to trigger this downward animation. Let's start by deleting this cube because it doesn't have an event trigger set up. Let's copy this one and paste it so that we get another event trigger, and let's move it into position so it's just a little nicer. Next, we need to rename this event so it has a unique name. So this one's box 1 and this one's box 2. So we're pretty much done with those smaller triggers. The next thing we need to do is set up a third trigger here. And what I recommend for this is actually to first create a simple cube here with transparency so that you can use this cube to visualize where your trigger is going to be. So let's just set this cube down, and what we need to do, let's just for now pretend that this is an event trigger. And what we need to do is for this event trigger to cover our entire area where all our other smaller triggers are. So let's set the scale to something like, oh, I don't know, 300 divided by 65. That seems about right. And I'll tell you why I'm dividing by 65 in a minute. This will be 100 divided by 65, and this will be 500 divided by 65. So this covers our area pretty well. Now let's go back here to our events folder and set down the event trigger. And these scale values are going to be the numbers that I typed in before without dividing by 65. So 300 by 100 by 500. And you can see that the event trigger pretty much matches the cube golden symbol that we placed earlier. This is why I divided by 65 earlier, because the units between the two objects are about divisible by 65. It's a little off, you can tell on the edges here, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. What we're going to do now is select both this large event trigger and the cube golden symbol, and we're going to group them so that we can move them as one object. And from there, we need to inspect our children and then set an event name for this event trigger. Let's set it to LargeTrigger, and then we want our cube here to listen for that LargeTrigger event. So let's set our event listener to LargeTrigger. So now what's going to happen is when we touch this very large trigger, then our cube is going to go down. And we aren't using either of our smaller triggers right now. We'll get to those in a second. The first thing that you need to do, well, this is a very confusing topic, but essentially what we need to do is move this cube down below the kill grid so you can't touch this trigger, and then we need to set each of our smaller cubes to trigger this cube to animate upwards while it's under the kill grid. So it animates upwards each time you hit one of your cubes, and then by the time you hit your last cube, this large trigger will need to be moved, animated into your area here. So we need to move it down a certain amount, and in order to determine that amount, I have a formula set up over here. You don't need to use this. You can just play around with the numbers that I'm going to show you in a minute, but I like to use this formula because it makes it a lot easier. So let's just go through it real quick, and if you can't see very well this formula, if the text is too small, pull it up full screen. I'll also have it in the description so you'll be able to follow along. This first one is LargeTriggerHeight. So this is just the Y value of the large trigger here. We set that to 100. So that's 100 divided by 2. And then this next portion plus the absolute value of the road Y position. Our road, if we select our road here, our road's Y position is at 0.0. So our road's Y position is at 0. So let's just replace that with 0. And then we need to subtract our kill grid Y position. Our kill grid down here, the default for the kill grid position is negative 100. And the reason these are all variables is because you can change them. So this is 0 minus negative 100. Let's just say plus 100. And then that's times 2 times n plus 1. N is the amount of triggers that you have, the amount of smaller triggers. So in this case it would be 2. And then this next part is the kill grid Y position, which we don't have right now. The kill grid Y position, or not kill grid, it's not kill grid Y position. It's supposed to be your trigger Y position, your large trigger Y position, which we don't have right now. That's what this formula determines. How far down does this large trigger need to go? That's what this first formula will determine. So we can go ahead and fill in the in values for 2 because we have 2 triggers, but we can't fill this in yet until we determine what this is. So 100 divided by 2, 50. Absolute value of 100 of 0 plus 100. Well, that's just 100. So let's just go through this and fill it out. 50 plus 100, 150. 150 times 2, 300. That's negative 300 times 3, or 2 minus 1, 1. Negative 300 times 1, negative 300. Excuse me. So negative 300 is going to be what we set our large trigger Y position to, negative 300. So you can tell it's below the kill grid pretty far. And then we can use this next formula to determine how far each animation needs to move it up. So before we do that, let's go ahead and add an animation to it. So let's add component, animator, and let's find the animator. Let's change the motion to advance, just like with this large cube. Disable rotation, change translate to global. And I'm just going to set this to 0 for now. I'm going to set the delay to 0 and the duration to as little as possible. I'm just going to type in 0. So it sets it at 0.01. We don't want it to loop. We want the curve type to be linear this time, so it just moves as fast as it can the entire duration of its animation. We don't need to animate physics because it's not a collidable object, and we do want to always animate because it's large and it's probably going to be off screen. And we want to set default action to none, just like before with our large cube over here. And then our event listener for this large trigger will be set to either one of our cubes. It really doesn't matter which one, but I'm going to use box 1 so it's easy to keep track of which one we used first. And then set off action to none, just as before. So now that we've moved this down here, we need to determine how far to translate it vertically on each animation cycle. And that's what this second formula here is for. So our trigger Y position is -300, and the absolute value of -300 is 300. 5 times 2 is 10, and 300 minus 10 is 290. 290 divided by 2, well, we can just type that in here. And it gives you 145. So that tells you that you need to move this thing vertically 145 on every animation cycle for your 2 triggers here. And we can take a look at that. If we say -300 plus 145, we can see where this trigger ends up. We can see it's just barely below the kill grid here. You've got about 5 units worth of space here, because our trigger is 100 units tall, which is about 50 units halved. Half of 100 is 50. So you've got 50 units here, minus 50 from this, or plus 50 because you're under the kill grid, would be minus 100, which is where your kill grid is. So that's what the formulas are for, to determine, you know, how far it needs to move and still stay under that kill grid value that you set in the formula. So from here, let's do the same as we did with this cube before, and let's group it with itself and then add another animator. And let's change the motion to advanced, disable rotate, let's set translate type to global, and let's set that translate vector to the same thing as before, 145, that we did with the other translate vector. 0 delay and very little duration, no loop. Let's set it to linear so it just moves as fast as it can the entire time of the duration. And no, don't animate physics, and always animate because it's large and probably off screen. Default action is none, and let's set up the event listener for our second box here. Off action is going to be none, and our event name is going to be our second box. So the reason we're drawing this cube as a golden simple cube with transparency is so you can view what's happening. So let's go ahead and jump off the edge here, and we can see that large cube down there at the bottom. Now pay very close attention to how far down it was. Let's go ahead and touch our first cube here, and then look at how close it is. It's basically at the kill grid, but we still can't touch it. So when we touch this second cube here, it's gonna come into our area here. You can see it just instantly snapped up into our area, and then this large collidable cube moved down, because that's what we set the large trigger to animate. We set this large trigger to animate this cube. You can see with the flashing line here. So I highly recommend using this golden simple cube trick with transparency to visualize your large trigger here. And then what you can do afterward, when you're done, you can set your inspect children to combined, and then set these materials to black and transparent so that you can't see it anymore. just like this. And then set your golden symbol to additive transparency instead of multiplicative, and then it'll be completely invisible. It will very slightly mess up the skybox. If you are able to see the stars in the YouTube video with the compression, you'll notice that the stars get dark when we touch that second cube because we're inside the cube, and if we continue to boost off in the distance here, you'll notice that all the stars come back when we enter and leave this area. Oh, I think I left collision on this cube. So let's disable collision. And we don't need reflect on this cube either. So even without collision, you'll notice that all the stars get dimmer. And I'm not entirely sure how to fix this, except for not using a golden symbol cube when you with your large animator or large trigger. But it can be very nice for visualizing your trigger when you're just playing around with it. So I highly recommend keeping this here just so you can visualize it while you're still playing around and messing with it. So it's a lot easier to determine, you know, where your cube is. And let's set spec color up just a little so we can see it a little better. Okay. So now let's say you wanted to add a third box here. You wanted to add a third collectible or a third ring or a third trigger. So how would you go about doing that? I'm going to go ahead and copy these formulas back into this description box here so that we can use them again for the third trigger. Okay, so now we've got our formulas back in here. And we also need another trigger box. So I'm just going to copy that, paste it, and we'll just move it up here and we'll set it to 0 right in the middle. And we also need to rename our event. So now we've got 3 trigger boxes. Our first 2 are already set up, but we need to redetermine how far down our large trigger needs to be and how far it needs to translate on every cycle. So let's go ahead and do that. Our large trigger height is 100. Divide by 2 is 50. The road Y position and the killgrid Y position we already know, so that's 0 plus 100 is 100. Absolute value is still 100. 50 plus 100 times 2, that's still 300. So as long as you're using the default values of the road height at 0 and the killgrid height at -100, and your play area isn't too tall, so your trigger height is just 100, then this first value is always going to be -300. So you can pretty much ignore that first entire thing if you're just using default values in a test map. But once you start using this in a real map where you have roads at varying heights and you have your trigger is going to need to be much taller, then you're going to have to use those values. But for now, you can just remember that this is -300 in your test map. So let's set n to 3 this time because we have 3 triggers. 3 minus 1, well, 2. And then 2 times -300 is -600. So that's how far down our trigger needs to go. About double. Exactly double. So now our trigger Y position is at negative 600. Absolute value, 600. 5 times n is 3, so 15. And then 600 minus 15 is 585. And divide by n, which is 3. Not 0.3, 3. 585 divided by 3. So let's just come down here and change all of our translate vectors to 585 divided by 3. And you can do quick math like that in these input values here. You can also do things like random numbers and spacings. If you select multiple objects, you can have objects spaced, but I'm not going to get into all of that. So this is 195. We need to go back and change our translate vectors, all of them, to 195. And we also need to set our third trigger. So we need to select this object and group it again, Control G, group it with itself. And then we need to add component, add an animator, set the motion to advanced, no rotate, set the translate height to global. We need the translate vector to be 195, which we determined with our formula, delay to 0, and duration as little as possible, no loop, linear, not animating physics, and always animate because it's definitely off screen now at minus 600. Default action to none, and set up our event listener with our third event trigger. Off action to none. And now you can see, if you jump off the edge here, that cube is very far down. It's very hard to even see at this point. Let's hit our first cube and jump off and see if our cube moved up. It looks like it moved up. It's hard to tell. Let's hit our second cube and hope that our large cube in the back doesn't move. It doesn't. And this trigger has moved up. And then let's hit our third cube here. And we jumped inside that trigger. So our large cube moved. You can also tell that the trigger is a little lower this time. That's because of the nature of these formulas. It's subtracting 5 for every trigger that you have. You could play around with that, tweak it a little bit. So you would just add 1 or 2 to each of your translate vectors. So let's just not do that. Let's add, I don't know, maybe 2 to each of our translate vectors. Make it 197 on all of them. We need to inspect children again so we can see all of them. 197 and 197. The important thing is that once you hit 2 of your triggers, you can't jump off and touch the large trigger. That's the most important thing. So you need to test hitting every single one of your triggers except the last one, and then jumping off and making sure you can't just ram into the kill grid to hit your large trigger. Anything beyond that is fine, but you also need to make sure that your translate vectors are all exactly the same value. And the reason for this is because you can hit these triggers, these small triggers, in any order. So I can bypass the first and second one, and then hit the third, and then go back and hit the first, and then go and hit the second. And the same thing happens as if I hit them in order 1, 2, 3. And this is really important. It also makes for better map design when you can hit any of these triggers in any order, so you can go back and get ones that you missed. If you, for example, hit 1 and then you go over here to hit the second, but there's a barrier and you blow up, or you fly around it and you miss this one but you hit that one, because all sorts of things can happen in your actual maps that you're making. You never know what players are going to do. Anyway, that's pretty much the basics of animators and what you can do with them. You can continue to add more of these triggers and stack them up and go back through this formula to figure out how far down it needs to go and how much it needs to translate each time. Or you can just mess around and play with the numbers and see what works. Either way. But for now, if you have any questions, go ahead and comment below. I'll include a link to download the beginning of this map where you can go back and follow along if you didn't already do that. Or you can download the finished version of the map here with all 3 triggers and all the animators so that you can just look at all the properties and see how it's working, or start from here and do something else with it. So if you've got any further questions, please comment below. I'll probably also include a written Steam guide that has screenshots and a whole bunch of other text and useful stuff that you can use at some point after publishing this video. But thanks for watching. Hope it helps. Go make awesome maps.